So just yesterday, I got back from the Geography Makes a Difference conference led by the Geographical Association in Sheffield. Now, it's the second time me going to the conference specifically in Sheffield, and maybe the fourth or fifth time I've either been to the conference or presented there. So I was very, very excited and looking forward to seeing many people who I know, who I've collaborated with, and just to be honest, traveling back to the UK during the spring was something to look forward to. So my journey there took me through London Heathrow and then via St Pancras, making my way up via a fast train to Sheffield itself. Now, I'm a big fan of traveling on the train through the countryside and being back in familiar territory in Sheffield and knowing my way from the train station through to the hotel made life a lot easier. Though after all these years of consultations and being in different places, I still can't get over the liminal space that is the corridors of hotels. Now, once I was settled, it was straight to sleep and straight to the next day, going to the Sheffield Hallam University to join the conference on what was the second day of the conference, going to some great sessions and some great keynote lectures, and supporting Simon Oakes in his delivery of the Managing Political Change and Challenge in the Geography Classroom presentation, joined also by Richard Bustin and Steve Brace, giving a response to some of the ideas presented by Simon. And then it was time for my session, Rethinking the Power of Geographic Frameworks, which I centered with the question: what responsibility do we carry when the geography we teach becomes the way students understand their place in the world? Now, during the session, we looked at the use of frameworks through the lens of geographies of hope, defining hope and looking at the cognitive tool of frameworks as something which can sometimes limit thoughts and creativity within the classroom, and how we can rethink its use for it to be a jump-off point for aspiration. We are not simply consumers of frameworks. We are witnesses to the reality that they describe. In all, the session was a great success, and I was glad for the ideas to be well received and look forward to developing them further. That is my idea for rethinking the framework in geography. Once the session was done, it was out into windy Sheffield again, enjoying some of the beauty of nature and the cherry blossoms in full bloom. But then I received this awful text message, something you never want to get while traveling. So suddenly I found myself rebooking flights and rushing to the airport several hours before I was intended to be there. But thankfully, I made it. Though I ended up in a middle seat, I was just happy to be able to get home the night that I intended and be back with my loved one. Now, a big thank you to the people who have helped me refine these ideas over the years, especially Simon Oakes, going through each other's presentations and making sure things are accessible and on point. And for anyone who's interested in seeing the full lecture, just keep an eye out for the next posts I do. Now, I can't wait until next year, and I look forward to hopefully seeing some new faces there so that we can work together to create an inclusive and accessible geography that is hopeful for the future and for our students.